Hey guys, today we're going to be checking out Borderlands 4 using the RTX 5090. We're using the Gaming X Trio version of the card. It has 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory and is, of course, at this point, the most powerful GPU on the market. We're playing on the latest NVIDIA drivers, and I am not implementing any sort of DLSS override, so we'll see what it has just coming with it default. We're pairing with a 9800X3D as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5, and I will mention that about a month ago or so, I did a video where I benchmarked actually all three of the prior Borderlands games, Borderlands 1, 2, and 3, on the 5090. So if you're interested in how the game historically has performed over the course of its lifespan, go ahead, check out that video. I'll link it here and in the description below. And of course, there will be timestamps for all of our settings that we test in this video. Let's hop in. All right, starting off here at 1080p. It's kind of tough to see, but you can kind of see off to the side here that we are on preset K. So this does by default, without any sort of injection, use that transform model of DLSS, which is nice. This game actually comes suited with pretty much everything that you could want from a modern AAA or quadruple A release, however you want to put it. There's a frame rate limit. Of course, we'll leave that off, but just out of curiosity, this does go up to 240. So it is a very high frame rate limit, which is kind of nice when it offers that in game. You know, if you found yourself getting like 180, 100, whatever average, and sometimes dipping above and below, and it's not super smooth, being able to come in here and set, say, like 150 FPS limit, that is nice to use for this benchmark. Of course, we're not going to set an FPS limit. There's also a display stats overlay. It's very, very bare bones. It's just an FPS counter, so it just appears in the top right. Obviously, we're not going to use that. We'll leave field of view and vehicle field of view alone. We're not going to adjust that. Really, the settings that we're interested in here are in our advanced options here. I would stay away from the run auto detect here because, as you can see, it is quick, but on a 5090 it throws us on very high as opposed to badass, and then it defaults to using TSR. Now, I don't know about you, but me personally, if I have an NVIDIA card, I would never use TSR. I'd use DLSS. So because it doesn't really like to just opt for DLSS by standard, not going to use that auto detect. But it is interesting that it doesn't put us on badass, considering we have essentially the top of the line card on the market. You would think it would put us on the highest settings, but regardless, you can see it also has frame generation and it has multi-frame generation, so we can enable this and go all the way up to 4x. To start off here at 1080p, this is not a resolution I think the 5090 is really, many 5090 users are really going to target 1080p. I'm sure there are people who have 1080p monitors who play on a 5090 and want really great performance, so I will test out a few settings, but I'm not going to go super in-depth. To start off here, I just want to go for max possible settings, so this is using badass settings. DLAA, which I'll show in a minute. This actually, I know this isn't super clear full resolution at DLSS, but this does actually use that preset K model. It still shows the overlay that it is active. We also have screen capture quality, that option, NVIDIA reflex, and then all of our standard options like texture quality, shadow quality, lighting, things like that. As far as I know, this game does not use any form of ray tracing from what I can tell here. At least if it does, it's not super well defined. And I will mention, last thing, is that this is it's an Unreal Engine 5 game. Motion blur quality, I'm just going to turn this to off, no motion blur, only a setting that I'm going to adjust. Otherwise, this is completely maxed out settings. I'm about an hour and a half into the game, so still relatively early. But this is an Unreal Engine 5 game, so we'll see. Hopefully, the 1% lows are okay. I think Unreal Engine 5 games have been getting better, so let's check it out. So given the 1080p nature, I do think this is definitely where, you know, using a good form of anti-aliasing comes in handy. And as you can see, I've heard a lot about this game's performance already, and 1080p max settings using 400 watts and giving us 100 FPS with 45 1% lows. Have to say, pretty terrible experience, and we're really just like in our kind of outpost that we just unlocked here, so still not a very demanding portion of the game. I will mention too, this particular test here, I imagine that it's not going to be like super clean as far as, you know, just kind of like comparing like to like we're not going to have a strict run. This is like an open world type game, so I'll kind of just proceed through the game from where I was, and we can kind of take a look at the FPS. But obviously, other thing you may want to keep an eye on, and It's a bit concerning. We'll see if it goes down. But our CPU utilization is also incredibly high, and our 9800X3D is getting pretty hot. Now, when the 5090 is at full utilization or near full utilization, and our CPU is also being utilized to a pretty meaningful degree, the CPU does get kind of hot. I will mention, though, I do have a 360mm AIO on the 9800X3D, but the way that the 5090 dissipates heat, in my case, and again, I have all the specs for all the coolers, the case, everything that I have. I also do have the temperature throttling for the 9800X3D set to, I believe, 90 degrees. So it won't actually, or either 90 or 94 degrees. It's set high to the point where it never really throttles by thermals. So even though you may see that the temperature is rising, the 9800X3D just kind of runs a bit hot. It's not actually going to affect our performance in any way. Because of the fact that, and I have run a lot of synthetic benchmarks to confirm that the temperature of the CPU does not actually affect performance. But I do have to say, we are using DLAA, which is not nothing. It is a pretty demanding piece of technology, but I would definitely at 1080p using a 5090, at native resolution here, I would definitely like to see a bit better performance. Now, the game itself, it uses like the same kind of cel-shaded art style that we've seen in the other Borderlands games. So, to be honest with you, it doesn't really look like miles and miles better than some other entries in the series, especially having just replayed through, Borderlands 1, 2, and 3. While this does look better, I will say it doesn't look like super considerably better. I understand that it is like an open world game, but I would like to be seeing I'd expect, if you're just throwing me in before playing the game or before seeing anything about the game, I'd be expecting like 150, 200 frames per second. Now, it's not necessary that you need such high frames per second. Of course, we do have technologies that we'll check out to kind of help us reach that point, and especially considering the fact that it, does come stock default with preset K is certainly a good thing. It's nice to see that, we have good options for kind of getting to our desired FPS. I would like to see that, just using like max settings here, I would hope to see better performance than we're seeing here. So this is definitely not super promising as we increase resolution, and certainly also isn't super promising when we're kind of thinking towards the future about testing out some other GPUs. So kind of seemingly seems to be another poorly optimized Unreal Engine 5 game, which does look good. It's a pretty looking game. I'm not saying it's ugly, but I don't know if it looks necessarily good enough to warrant such drastic performance, like being so demanding on the performance end. The other thing I will mention is the 1% lows are not great at 42. It's not like super noticeable. If you look at our frame time graph, it's kind of choppy. I'm not really noticing a ton of like major stutters just in like normal gameplay. But I will say it doesn't feel like the most fluid experience ever. So around 94 on our average, 42 1% lows here. This is at max 1080p using DLAA. So hopefully we can get to a better place. But to start off with, not super great. And of course, like normal, to kind of reclaim a bit of that FPS, we have two options, our graphics, and then really, the other option is to bump down our resolution or to increase our upscaling. So let's bump down from full resolution DLAA down to quality. Now, quality, as you can see, uses 713p as our render resolution. And given the fact that we are on preset K, typically at 1080p, upscaling, in my opinion, doesn't look great, just because 1080p is not a super high resolution as is. And when you do start implementing upscaling at already what amounts to be a pretty low resolution, sometimes it results in a pretty blurry image and actually results in like some weird artifacting. Now, as far as like our native options, I'll go ahead real quick and back out. You can see what we're getting here. If we just turn off upscaling completely, we do have anti-aliasing, but it just kind of shows on or off. There's only one option for anti-aliasing. It's FXAA. So if we were okay just using a cheaper form of anti-aliasing being FXAA here, you could also reclaim a bit of FPS, but I will say this looks considerably worse than DLAA and actually considerably worse than even DLSS at quality. So at least at 1080p, maybe at 4K, maybe worth exploring the FXAA option. However, at least at 1080p, I would really steer away this looks like a very, very nasty looking image. Like if I zoom in on some of these far away objects, you can just see it's almost like the cell shading art style of this game doesn't really agree with the FXAA. So these black borders and kind of like sharp contrast lines of some of our objects off in the distance, like they don't really render or agree with the FXAA resolution or the rendering of excuse me, of those faraway objects. So we were able to get a bit more when going for DLSS quality. Let's actually go down to balance here, which is probably the furthest that I'd really be super happy going down to when we're talking about, you know, using DLSS at 1080p. I will show, just, you know, for the sake of you know, being thorough here, I will show the ultra performance mode, or the performance mode. I'm actually not even sure if the game has ultra performance, but as you can see, the game still looks pretty solid. I mean, the transformer model is really pulling a lot of weight here. You know, it's really, really great to have. And although it's easier than ever to implement transformer, even if it didn't come default, it is nice that without any work, you know, you can go ahead and throw it on and get really, really solid performance. And I guess this is a boss that I'm agitating here. I did not, wasn't really aware of that, but as you can see, I mean, the game looks really great in my opinion. It is a really pretty looking game and is being rendered really, really nicely, despite the fact that our frame rate is, in my opinion, leaving a bit to be desired. As I thought I killed those guys, but I guess these are not enemies that are going to work for our fight for your life. But yeah, balance here around 116 FPS on our average. Definitely not like too bad. You can see that, you know, certainly the image still is holding up, but our other option that we have when we're talking about increasing our resolution is frame generation. And coming from like 100 plus FPS, you know, that does put us into a place where we can definitely use a bit of frame generation and still get pretty solid results. So if we go ahead and enable frame generation, just leave it at 2x for now. Now counting our FPS is going to result in some kind of wonky result, so I'm not going to do that. You can see we also have an overlay for our counting of FPS, but this now does bring us up to 200 FPS. And as far as the latency goes, it's actually not too bad due to the fact that our frame rate was already pretty high to begin with. So around 200 FPS here, using balanced at ultra or badass settings, which essentially are ultra settings. Obviously, Borderlands is a little cute with their naming conventions, but this is obviously, you know, another option if you wanted to get a bit more FPS. Frame generation for a game like this that's not like a competitive game, you know, you obviously are going to be playing with other players, but it's not like you're really relying on like pinpoint accuracy or anything like that. Certainly, you know, I would not bemoan anyone for wanting to use a bit of frame generation to kind of reclaim a bit of that performance. So around like 180 to 200 FPS here using 2x. And of course, you know, as we bump this up more and more, there will be slightly more input latency as we kind of increase this. Now at 3x, we're seeing around 270 FPS to 280 FPS. And, you know, while there is more input latency, it's not super, super noticeable, given the fact that our FPS is already, once again, coming from such a high place. So I guess just while we're here, let's go ahead, throw on 4x, and we'll just see, you know, maxing out our frame generation here. Input latency still feels okay. It's not too bad. And now we are seeing obviously incredibly high FPS sitting right around 360 to like 400 FPS at times, depending on what exactly we're doing. Now down to the 350s. So obviously, you know, this is good performance. If you're okay using frame generation, it certainly will result in pretty good looking picture. Just doesn't necessarily feel the best all the time, but given the fact that we are already using a bit of DLSS for our upscaling, kind of helps with not feeling too terrible. Now, what if we didn't want any sort of frame generation? We just want to turn that off, but we were okay using ultra performance DLSS, which even though we do have the transform model, this is typically a setting that I would like to avoid. As you can see, it just looks pretty terrible here. Like super blurry, given the fact that we are using 1080p. This is now using 361p, which I do have to say is pretty impressive that a 360p image, like if you guys remember watching old YouTube videos at 360p, you know how many pixels that is, how terrible that really looks, given the fact that this is able to output to a somewhat convincing, kind of not that convincing 1080p image is impressive enough, but as you can see, our frame rate is actually not even going up that much when we are implementing these settings. So, you know, it is what it is. I probably wouldn't go personally below balanced, at least when we are talking about playing at our 1080p resolution. Now, of course, your other options here are to kind of bump down settings. So if we go down to very high, we'll go back on native using DLAA. We can see just what this gets us. Remember, we were getting just about like 80 to 90 here at Badass, and as you can see, we do reclaim a bit of that FPS and get back our really great looking picture at this point. So you have options for how you want to get your FPS, and honestly, going from Badass to very high doesn't look too different. Now, using a 5090, especially at 1080p, I think most people, myself included, would like to be getting, you know, like maximum possible FPS without the use of any sort of upscaling or needing to bump down settings. And the fact that we are having to move from that Badass setting is a bit disappointing. But regardless, you know, if you were okay kind of just bumping down settings, not even that much, just a little bit down to the next nearest preset, does give you about like a 15 to 20 FPS increase, and really doesn't look all that different just when we're talking about, you know, actual visual quality. In my opinion, I still think the game looks like pretty great here using very high as opposed to Badass, which I hate saying Badass for our settings, but you know, is what it is what the preset's called. So this is definitely another way to kind of reclaim a bit of that FPS. And now you can see that our CPU, interestingly enough, has become the bottleneck, where our GPU utilization is kind of fluctuating all over the place, at times into the low 90s, now 96. Actually here, maybe I'm not super confident that this is actually, can I pick that up? I'm not 100% sure actually at this point that we are CPU bound. This may be still a GPU bound scenario, but this is another way without using any sort of DLSS other than just using the DLAA to play it native to kind of render out some of those anti-aliasing issues. This is another method that you can use to kind of reclaim a bit of that FPS. So, you know, if you weren't happy with the FPS that you were getting at max Badass settings, you could definitely bump down to very high and still get a very good looking picture and reclaim a bit more of your FPS. Now looking at 110 average, and also an improvement to our 1% lows coming down to like around 45 all the way up to 70. Definitely feels much smoother. Now let's bump down a little bit more here and go for that balanced preset. So now this is using balanced at very high. I guess this is kind of, you know, if you wanted higher FPS, but you didn't want to sacrifice too much in terms of our graphics preset. So you really just wanted to use your upscaling to kind of get there. This is another way to get a bit more. Now our gains are like not super significant. I do think that there seems to be some sort of CPU issue here, even despite the fact that we are using 9800X3D. Still seems to be not quite enough to really propel us into a super comfortable place where we are getting, you know, a ton of FPS, but it does give you slight boosts. And the other benefit too here is we are getting another boost to our 1% lows. So now we're seeing 1% lows sitting around 90. So again, there are, you know, one of the good things about playing on PC is just that you have options when it comes to this stuff, you know. So it really looks like the benefit here of using upscaling is not necessarily so much to get higher FPS, just due to the fact that while we are getting higher, it's not like super considerable how much higher it's really going. Really the main benefit that we're getting here is just that we are improving our 1% lows pretty considerably here. Now let's bump down a little bit more here and go all the way down to the medium setting, and we'll go back to full resolution. So this is using DLAA here. And now medium in this game, like I've experienced in a lot of other games, as you can see, we're at DLAA. So this is very crisp looking image. It's really just the graphics preset that's changed. And this is another way to kind of reclaim a bit of that FPS. So what I have noticed in this game is kind of consistent from, you know, what I've been seeing in some other titles, is that really the medium preset is really the lowest I would go. The game seems to really drastically change when we move anywhere below medium. Like when we go to the low preset, we do get another pretty major boost to our FPS, but we also get a pretty considerable difference when we're talking about our actual visual quality. So here you can see also our CPU utilization is still very high. It does seem to be a pretty CPU demanding game. A bit surprising, not really what I would be expecting here. Could potentially be due to the open world nature of the game. But Don't want to spend a ton of time here at 1080p. You can see that there certainly is a CPU issue that we're kind of running into. Really, the only way to really get around it to any meaningful degree is to utilize the frame generation. So obviously, if we even just turn on 2x frame generation, you get relatively similar picture quality. Now we're getting 200 plus FPS. And given the fact that, once again, we are coming from such a high resolution already, it's actually really not that significant, or such a high FPS already. It's really not that significant as far as our latency goes. We're still getting, pretty much the same. I mean, I think if I really, paid super close attention, or if I was playing a multiplayer game, sure, I might be able to notice. But as far as just, playing the game and kind of, doing our normal stuff, not really super significant here. And just to show what this low preset looks like, go ahead and put it on using DLAA, and you can really see just how different the game looks when we go down to low. Now, you may not be able to notice, but it does look considerably different. Everything looks much more flat. The lighting, is much less dramatic. It's much more evenly lit. So I personally would probably avoid using the low preset, especially considering the fact that we have a 5090 that we're working with. Maybe on some lower end cards, I'd say, okay, go for the low preset. Now, you could, if you were someone who just wanted max possible FPS, you can certainly play here at low. And the game, while it does look different, it kind of still fits within that Borderlands theme of everything kind of being very, very cartoony. So while it does look worse, the textures and everything look very flat. It doesn't really look super out of place. I can see the argument to be made that, while it does look worse, it doesn't look too crazy, just given the fact that it already kind of is a pretty, it's a pretty cartoony and dramatized looking art style that going down to low, while it does make certain textures and things look kind of weird, it kind of still fits within the theme of Borderlands. So this is another way to get a bit of FPS back. You can see now we're sitting right around 160 and 1% lows. Once again, major bump up all the way up to around 120 FPS. So this does feel like a much smoother experience here. Just pretty incredible, a 5090 and 9800X 3D. It is able to render such better looking games at such better performance that for Borderlands here, a game that, to be honest with you, doesn't look absolutely incredible or anything like that, for it to really, not look that impressive and still be so demanding on the graphics end is a bit disappointing. All right, now moving up to 1440p, and once again, starting off at max settings. So this is using that badass preset at DLAA. Now, especially once we go up to DLAA, this is certainly where using once we go up to 1440p rather, using DLAA definitely becomes less and less important. But you can certainly see it does render a really nice looking image, albeit at the cost of quite a bit of FPS. So, while I would like to see a bit more, this is certainly still playable. 60 FPS, I don't know. On PC, using a 5090, I think 60 FPS may sound like a snob here, but in my opinion, this is what I would consider to be not really acceptable performance. 70 FPS average, 35 FPS, 1% lows also feels pretty terrible and very choppy. So not really personally where I would want to be at. Now, thankfully, with the increase to our resolution, even going down to balance here, it's certainly something that is on the table, and you are able to reclaim a good bit of FPS by doing so. So bumping down here to balance does bring us up to right around 90 FPS on our average, and also does give us an improvement to our 1% lows. So, there's different ways to kind of achieve the performance that you kind of want to see. It's just a bit disappointing that, it's obvious that, the badass preset is pretty demanding. Can't really actually 100% determine what is making it so demanding. We are also next to this water feature, so certainly cases where water is, a more demanding area, but, given the open world nature of the game, you can't really always, predict or anticipate when you'll come into contact with a particular environmental, scene, if there's water around. So not necessarily not indicative of the kind of performance that you'd see. But as you can see, still it's decent performance, but not great. And the 1% lows are still kind of an issue. The Unreal Engine I was kind of hopeful that Unreal Engine, Unreal Engine 5 has been better in a lot of the games I've been testing, but it still seems to be not super great in this particular title, seeing, around 60 FPS, 1% lows at a 90 FPS average. And as you can see, our frame time graph also just kind of, indicating that it's not a super smooth experience. So once again, we'll go ahead and we'll start just by implementing frame generation. Now these frame generation tests, while I don't think that they're super all that enlightening, just due to the fact that, you can kind of just do the math and figure out what frame generation would give you. And as long as we're above, like probably right around like 60 to 90 FPS is kind of the cutoff point from where, you'd be able to like really reliably notice the input latency. Definitely if you're at like 50 FPS, you'll, notice some input latency, if that's even important to you. Now at when we're at like 90 FPS going up to 170 right around, but definitely in kind of like that in-between area where you may not necessarily notice or care about the slight amount of latency, if it's worth it to get a little bit smoother of an image here. I certainly could understand someone going for this, and this way we are still able to get a really solid looking picture. The balance preset here at 1440p does look really strong, and we're not having to compromise on any of our graphics presets. We're still playing at max settings here. The only thing that we're really playing with is just using the card to kind of use upscaling, and then on top of upscaling, frame generation to kind of achieve our FPS. So as far as like actual visuals go, still getting really strong looking visuals. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of achieve that FPS and frame generation. While I don't know, I'd like to see frame generation be something that you kind of look towards on lower end 50 series cards or 40 series cards to kind of achieve a playable FPS at games that typically wouldn't really be super great on those lower end cards, where I don't really love to see frame generation used as almost like a crutch, like we're seeing here on already these very high end cards, just to get higher FPS. Now of course our other option here is just to bump down our settings. So let's go down to very high. We'll go back to full resolution using DLAA, turn off our frame generation here, and we'll see just how demanding that badass setting was as opposed to very high. And at least to begin with here, it doesn't actually look like we're seeing a major difference as we're kind of going through this particular scene. But as you can see, the other thing that kind of comes and rears its head is just these pretty terrible 1% lows. 36 FPS on a 1% low. You can see our frame time graph has like this consistent like hitch in our frame time graph. Every now and then you see how it spikes, almost looks like an EKG, like it's just spiking, and it does actually feel, like you can actually feel it when you're playing the game. You can really feel, that it doesn't really feel super fluid. So it's not just something that you see on the graph. It does actually become apparent when you're playing the game that it's just not a super consistent, great experience. However, I will say, moving over to DLAA again, the picture quality that you get from DLAA, just the amount of clarity and sharpness in the image, in my opinion, is more important than, the graphics preset, as far as like moving from badass down to very high. Going for, a DLAA or a better anti-aliasing or upscaling option that doesn't use so much of a lower resolution is certainly something that I am really noticing. And that may also be due to the fact of kind of like this like cartoony comic book type art style. These sharp corners, sharp edges do look really nice when they are, being rendered properly. So I do think that this may be something that, you want to prioritize, as opposed to just getting a higher number on your FPS, actually getting, a cleaner, crisper looking image is probably more important more often than not. So let's just go one down here and just go for quality here at very high, and just see how much of an improvement that gets us. And it does get us back up to 100. However, as you can see, we're still getting these kind of like hitches that are pretty annoying to have to deal with at 1440p here, even on very high, even bumping down our settings slightly. These stutters are pretty annoying here, not really something that I would love to be having to deal with. Now, it doesn't make the game like unplayable or anything like that. I wouldn't say so necessarily. I mean, a lot of games nowadays do have these kind of like stutters. It's not a great thing, and I don't think it's something that, people should really put up with, but, it is just unfortunately at this point the reality of kind of how games are being made and released is that there are tons of games that have like inconsistent frame times that come out kind of as stuttery messes, and this seems to be another one of those type of releases. It's a bit disappointing considering the fact that, like I said, in my opinion, this game doesn't look like way better or different than some of the older Borderlands games, and those games did come out and look much better. So, you know, seeing as keep dying to the same boss here. Let's see if we can come back here. But seeing, you know, a game that looks pretty much like 90% the same as like Borderlands 3, and to see it get like such worse performance is a bit disappointing, I will say. Like to see, you know, at least like the same performance, or, you know, maybe even if we are getting a dip, I would like that dip to rather just than being, you know, FPS dip. Like I'd prefer just a lower FPS as opposed to like the actual, you know, stableness of the frames. It just kind of seems to be a result of the Unreal Engine 5 nature of the release. So, you know, Unreal Engine 5 is an engine that obviously developers love working with, given the fact that it has been so, you know, widely adopted. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen an engine be adopted by so many different developers so quickly. So I'm sure that it is an engine that developers really like, and that it's easy to work with and make games look pretty for, you know, trailers or promotional materials. But when it comes to actual experience playing the game, when you're kind of seeing these like pretty terrible stutters. So while 100 FPS looks good, 44, 45 FPS, 1% lows do not feel good. And certainly, you know, I think most people would be happy with, you know, slight visual degradation in order to get a bit smoother and more consistent frame time. So it is a bit disappointing. Now let's go down to medium here. We'll go back to full resolution, so using DLAA, which does look really solid here. And you can see I'm expecting the same thing we kind of saw at 1080p to a slightly less severe degree, but I'm assuming that this is going to kind of result in a bit of a CPU bottleneck situation. So where we're seeing, you know, relatively the same GPU utilization, but you can see like the amount of watts that's being pulled, and then how much CPU is being used does seem to be indicative of our CPU kind of being like the thing that's really preventing us from getting too high of FPS. Typically when you know, when you would see way different performance, you know, that seems to be more indicative of a GPU bound scenario, but we're not really seeing too much of a difference, even despite the fact that we are lowering our graphic settings. That to me says that the CPU is the thing that's actually bottlenecking us in this particular situation. So really at this point, the only way to really get higher FPS would be to use, you know, frame generation. Seems like 1440p is going to be a situation where we're really just not seeing a ton of gains at this point. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see. I think even when we move up to 4K, I'm actually, you know, the good thing I guess is I'm actually expecting somewhat similar performance than we're seeing here. So 106 on our average here. We'll go ahead and we'll just switch really quick here. So, or if we were to go down to balance, I'm actually not expecting a massive difference. Yeah, and it's really only like a very minor difference, typically, you know, going from DLAA, which is incredibly demanding, all the way down to balance. Typically that result in, you know, a much more significant performance increase. And as you can see here, while it does give us a slight boost, it's really not super significant. So unfortunately, it does seem to be that this is going to be kind of the max of what you're working with this particular combination. Now, if you had a 9950 X3D, potentially, you know, we'd have to wait for side-by-side comparisons to see if maybe the 9950 does perform better. It's not really so much marketed as a gaming CPU. It's kind of a all-purpose productivity CPU that can also do the benefits of the gaming side. But as you can see, not a huge difference here moving down your preset. So honestly, I'd probably just stick with very high or badass here. Use DLAA or use some slight upscaling to reclaim a bit of that FPS. And then if you're unhappy with the FPS you're getting, that is where unfortunately you are just going to have to kind of resort to utilizing the frame generation, which, you know, for me personally, I don't love using frame generation, as I don't know why these enemies here don't have health bars anymore. Don't know what happened there. I don't really love using frame generation when it comes to first-person shooters, but given the fact that we are getting like high enough FPS, it doesn't really feel too bad to use a bit of frame generation. It just kind of, in my opinion, sucks knowing that we have a 5090 that is, you know, in a lot of other games and supposed to be such a high-powered GPU, and that we are having to artificially insert frames to kind of get our desired performance. Just doesn't feel good, almost just from a, you know, like how it, you know, feels standpoint, as opposed to like how it actually feels as far as you know, our actual gameplay experience. It just doesn't feel good having a, you know, $2,000 GPU and having to artificially insert frames into a game that honestly doesn't even look like all that amazing to get a you know, more competitive, you know, good feeling FPS is a bit disappointing. All right, and finally here, moving up to 4K, which is really where I think the 5090 should be ran at. I mean, to get the money out of your 5090, you know, playing at 4K resolution is really what most people probably want to be doing. So 4K, and we are going to start off here at max settings using DLAA. We'll start off just by using DLAA briefly. I really don't think DLAA is super necessary at 4K, but I do think it is interesting just to see what we can get. And as you can see, it's not good. So at 4K max settings at native resolution using DLAA, which is a very demanding form of anti-aliasing. It is very demanding. Results in a really good looking picture, but it is demanding. And even, you know, the transform model compared to the CNN model is also just a tad bit more demanding. So really, these are completely maxed out settings. And unfortunately, even 60 FPS is not possible. So is a bit disappointing. I mean, a 5090 9800X 3D combination should result in at least 60 FPS at 4K max settings in most games, in my opinion. And if there was to be a game to kind of break it and not give you that 60 FPS, I wouldn't expect it to be a game that looks like this, if I'm being completely honest. It may sound harsh, but I just don't think that this is really a game that looks good enough to warrant such heavy performance. Now, before we move on to our upscaling and some of our other options, I do want to see just if we didn't want DLAA, which again, it's not necessary. If we did just want to either use no anti-aliasing, we'll test this. I guess I haven't really tested this at all. So no anti-aliasing whatsoever, you can see, does give us a slight FPS boost, still not 60 FPS. Now, no anti-aliasing whatsoever. Doesn't look great, as you can see, like on the ground. There's just like a lot of these like very fine details when it comes to how the blades of grass are like kind of outlined in these black shapes. Kind of results in like a little bit of this kind of weird situation here. Now, doesn't look terrible. Like, I don't know, Borderlands is kind of a funny game because like the things that don't look good, it almost looks like they intentionally don't look good. But, you know, as far as like any other game, this would be unacceptable, of course. So around 46 FPS, not honestly all that different. And if we were to go for that FXAA option, which really I would try to stay away from, but FXAA, you can see it gets us around the same, should be a very minor decrease. So maybe like a 1 or 2 FPS decrease, but honestly, it looks pretty muddy. Really, what you're going to want to be doing here at max settings, especially considering the fact that we do have the transform model, is you want to be using that DLSS. Even just at quality, DLSS here will look considerably better than even using FXAA or no anti-aliasing. So this is now using essentially 1440p as our render resolution and then outputting that to 4K. And as you can see, this does get us pretty great results here as far as our picture quality. Now, as far as our FPS goes, this does now give us a 60 FPS average here. So this is also definitely another way to kind of reclaim a bit of that FPS. Let's see if we can find some enemies here to actually see what that might look like. But, you know, if you want to play at max 4K settings, you can do so. And as you can see, you know, it's not super different. It's kind of what I was somewhat expecting here. Just given the fact that, how do I get in here? Just given the fact that really, you know, it's not necessarily looking like it's too much of a GPU bottleneck that's kind of holding us back, but more so somewhat of a CPU issue that's really kind of keeping our performance from being too solid. So as you can see, we're still getting 60 FPS and a bit of combat here. Of course, there will be certainly more demanding mobs that might, you know, tank your FPS slightly more. But as far as just kind of running around here, experiencing what we're experiencing, does give us a consistent 60 FPS experience here at max settings and looks good. I would, again, hope for more than 60 FPS. Now, you could come in here at this point and implement frame generation and get, you know, around 100, 110 FPS. And you may feel a little bit of latency starting from 60 FPS, but it won't be super severe. Now, the other thing I will mention that would not result in a super good experience as far as our frame generation is just the fact that our stutters are still there. Frame generation does not get rid of stutters, unfortunately. You know, those stutters do still happen. So, and in fact, in a lot of cases, they actually feel worse when you're artificially inserting frames in between the stutters. So, fortunately, you know, that frame generation is not necessarily just like a magic bullet that's going to solve all your issues, but it will give you a higher FPS. There's no doubt about that. So, definitely have options that at our disposal to kind of use if we did want to artificially get higher FPS. But really, here at quality, this is really, especially at 4K, a really, really great looking picture. And really, you can come down a bit more. Now, due to the fact that we're at 4K now, I do actually expect coming down to balanced here to give us a slight FPS boost from what we're seeing. So where we were getting like high 60s, now we are seeing 70s and 80s. So this does now become a place where you can kind of see, you know, a bit higher FPS, and really, especially at 4K and using this transform model, you are also going to still be getting really, really solid picture quality. And 70 does now kind of put us into that territory where I may want to consider throwing on frame generation. So we'll just throw on 2x frame generation. Of course, you know how frame generation works is that, you know, we could go up to 3x and 4x and it would just introduce a bit more latency and obviously artificially increase our FPS. Not super interesting to test super in detail, but as you can see here, this does now get us into that 120 FPS place. Really great looking picture. Still looks like 4K, just a little bit of input latency, but not too bad. So, you know, it's not like a terrible experience necessarily. I really just wish that you didn't have to do this in order to get a playable or good FPS in this game, especially using this particular GPU combination. I would like to see this performance be, you know, kind of achieved in more organic means as opposed to, you know, coming in and artificially inserting frames. But you can still get here, albeit just in like a slightly different way. Now, of course, the other thing we could do is move down to very high, and we'll go ahead and go back here to our native DLAA option, and this should be another way that we can kind of reclaim a bit of FPS just to see, again, you know, obviously we weren't getting our desired or acceptable 60 FPS here previously, and I don't expect us to really see too dramatically different of an improvement here. But we do see now like 50 FPS does feel better slightly and does actually, you know, give us a bit more wiggle room when we start looking at our DLSS options. So going now for the quality preset using that very high setting, now you can see without any sort of frame generation or anything like that, we are now getting 70 FPS, which feels okay. You know, definitely in a game like Borderlands, you don't need, you know, super high FPS or anything like that to have a good experience. However, it does still, you know, leave a bit to be desired, especially coming on, you know, from a 5090. You'd expect to get definitely more FPS than this. Now, 4K is still a premium resolution, certainly, even on a 5090. A 5090 does still struggle with 4K in a lot of titles, so it's not super unusual for us to be seeing not great experience here. But, you know, just, you know, on a game that looks like this, again, I know I'm kind of a broken record at this point, but just given the fact that this game is, you know, not like the prettiest looking game in the world, doesn't seem like it should be nearly as hard to run as it actually is turning out to be, is a bit disappointing, but not super surprising. But, you know, as you can see here, we're still getting like solid performance and good looking visuals. The only thing really that I, you know, keep noticing, it's like I notice a stutter and then I look at our 1% lows, and 36 with this terrible frame time graph is pretty devastating, I will say, and is one thing that is certainly noticeable. Now, the frame generation, you can say, okay, maybe that's not so noticeable. Using the transform model for our upscaling, that's also, you know, kind of results in what I would consider to be pretty acceptable or even good performance or result. But nothing really seems to be able to fully resolve that 1% low issue. That seems to be kind of consistent, albeit, you know, slightly less noticeable when we start to increase our FPS through our different means here. That 1% low issue is kind of always hovering there in the background and doesn't really ever seem to be fully resolved from what we've been doing here. So just kind of seems to be, you know, an issue with the actual game and the game engine and the Unreal Engine 5 nature of it all. The fact that these 1% lows are just kind of pretty terrible. And really the last thing I do want to test here is just going down to medium. So this is really sacrificing pretty much all of our really great looking visuals to hopefully get a better looking picture, and also, you know, hopefully getting better 1% lows and a better overall FPS. So at medium settings here, playing at native DLAA, which again is not necessary, but does look good, you know, although it's not 100% necessary. It doesn't result in nothing. You know, that performance is going somewhere, and it is going towards giving you a pretty great looking image. And going down to medium here does now give us a 60 FPS average, and, you know, does that while looking pretty solid. Now the 1% lows, like I said, you know, they're still there. They're still not great. Our frame time graph is slightly less choppy than we saw on the higher settings, but still not great. 44 1% lows. Not a super great experience, but is, you know, slowly getting better and better. So this is really, like I said, the lowest I'd probably personally go. Having a $2,000 graphics card and having to go to medium settings, and especially low settings, is not really something that I want to really experiment too much with, although I will test it briefly here just to see what we can get. You know, this is now definitely playable at medium settings at native, and, you know, maybe I'm a bit old school in that I do still expect to be able to play at native resolution on these games and get an acceptable FPS. I really want, you know, the DLSS and especially the frame generation to really just be an added bonus to get a higher FPS, but I would like to see a playable FPS without any of those tricks being like as mandatory as the game actually seems to want to make them. So here you can see right around like 74 FPS average, 40 FPS 1% lows. Not a super great experience, but once again, you know, we do have at least a little bit of wiggle room here if we wanted to just go for quality. We'll see that that might give us all the way up to 100 FPS. 1% lows are still pretty terrible, sitting right around 45. And, you know, still looks great, of course. You know, the quality preset, again, this uses 1440p as our render resolution, outputs that to 4K, especially on the transform model. Looks amazing. However, you know, it doesn't really result in super like major improvement to our FPS. So whether or not that's something that you want to do, probably up to you. In my opinion, you know, you may as well, because for me, it's really tough to kind of see like any sort of major difference when it comes to comparing, you know, DLAA to DLSS quality. I think those two settings are pretty similar, although, you know, you're not playing at native any longer if that's important to you, but you can still play at, you know, really good looking picture here, and you will reclaim a bit of FPS. However, that 1% low issue is still persistent even with our upscaling turned on. So, you know, 67, while that doesn't seem super terrible when it comes to our 1% low, when your average is, you know, not that far off of that, like 112, only a 50% difference. And, you know, our frame time graph seems to be like relatively flat at this point. There are still the odd spikes here and there. So fortunately, you know, this Unreal Engine 5 is just, you know, every now and then there will be games that have, you know, Unreal Engine 5 and perform decent. And then there's other games that have Unreal Engine 5 and just have this like pretty annoying issue. So it's hard to really tell exactly what is causing it or how to address it. I mean, we've tried essentially every setting and pretty much everything aside from, you know, just implementing a ton of upscaling and frame generation still seems to have kind of just this issue where, you know, we're seeing these 1% lows that are pretty far off of our average, unfortunately, resulting in some pretty noticeable stutters. I don't know if they're really showing up on the video, but as far as just playing through the game here, not super great. Now, what if you wanted, just out of curiosity here, what if we just wanted to do low ultra performance frame generation at 4x? So this is, you know, if we wanted to play 4K, but we didn't really care about visuals, nothing, we just wanted highest possible FPS. So here you can, at this point now on low settings, you can trick the game into going all the way up to 400 FPS. And while it doesn't look great, you know, you can definitely see on the ground like how terrible things look. Doesn't look super amazing, but it does certainly, you know, artificially at least give us that, you know, major improvement to our FPS. Now, saying around 400 frames at 4x frame generation seems to indicate that if we were to turn off the frame generation, assuming we're right around 115 or so on our FPS. Oh, actually quite a bit more than that. Okay, that's more than I thought we'd be at. So I guess without the frame generation, we're right around 170. That's definitely more than I thought that we'd be at. I don't know. My frame generation math is not always the best here, but This is also definitely another way that you can come in and say, okay, I just have a 4K monitor, but I just want to play competitively. I just want to get the highest possible FPS. I don't really care about, visuals when it comes to our graphics presets or our upscaling. Trusting the transformer model to do all the work for me. This is another option. You can come in here and kind of just, crank everything down. And now, you can see our 1% lows are pretty acceptable, 124. Average at 170, frame time graph is essentially flat. No major spikes that we've seen thus far. We'll go ahead and agitate some of these enemies here, see if anything changes, but don't really expect it to be too different. Doesn't really seem like there's really anything that's super like affecting our FPS to any like super meaningful degree. It just kind of seems like our FPS is more based on just the general performance of the game. So you definitely have options here if you weren't so much of a snob when it comes to your upscaling and frame generation options. Especially, you can get high FPS as long as you are okay with using all the tricks that NVIDIA and Gearbox here has left for you to kind of achieve that FPS. You can do so. Just a bit of a bummer when we're talking about the highest possible configuration that someone might have when playing PC games. You'd like those people to have like a super great experience, so that the people with more modest setups or more mainstream setups that don't cost like 3 arms and 3 legs, so that they can still get pretty decent performance. Alright guys, that's been it for Borderlands 4 on the RTX 5090. Overall, a bit disappointing if I'm being completely honest. While the performance, you can get it up to a pretty high amount for how the game looks visually and how the previous entries in the series performed. It's a bit disappointing just how demanding this one is. If there's one good thing about what we've experienced here, is just that it has DLSS and it has transformer model by default, and it has all the frame generation, multi-frame generation. It has all the tricks in the book for, at least for NVIDIA cards. I haven't tested an AMD card quite yet to see if it has FSR4, but it does have all of the tricks by default. You don't really have to mess with like implementing or adding anything on your own, but it's a bit disappointing that even on very high-end cards that you do have to even resort to those methods in the first place. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.